Thank you. Thank you, and thanks for coming out on this gorgeous day. I know it's tempting to be throwing frisbees on the mall, but you're here, and I'm very grateful. I want to thank the sponsors of the series, Washington College and the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and of course the National Portrait Gallery, for the honor of being asked to be an American Pictures Distinguished Lecturer. I'm very grateful to Adam and to Marty Sullivan for the invitation. Well, this is the month of Lincoln's murder and martyrdom, as you know. 74 years ago, Washington was awash in mourning. Lincoln's body was on view at the White House. A secular saint had replaced the mortal politician. Forgotten, really, were the controversies that had attended him as he became president. Lincoln once remarked that he found it a bitter irony that so much bitterness and controversy had followed all of his election campaigns from the time he began his political career in the 1830s. The man had been replaced effectively by a larger-than-life hero. But today, I want to focus on one of the smallest pictures of Abraham Lincoln, one of the smallest pictures, I dare say, in the National Portrait Gallery collection, one that is not only surpassingly beautiful, but has an extraordinary story to tell as well, a story of how art intersected with photography, printmaking, and politics to impact public opinion during what was arguably the most controversial and important election in American history. The picture and the story behind it provide context and texture to the biggest irony of all about the Lincoln image, and that is that Lincoln, a man who joked constantly about his own appearance, who made his homeliness almost into a virtue, certainly the subject of conversation. If people wanted it to be an unspoken matter, Lincoln brought it out into the open. This fellow, not accidentally by the way, made himself dependably and profitably, both for himself and his image makers, relentlessly available to photographers, to sculptors, to painters. Marty Sullivan talked about his awareness of technology. Beyond technology, as we'll see today, there was an astute awareness of the fine arts, rare in someone who had really never seen the fine arts. And these portrayals, in turn, would influence his election and his transformation into national sainthood. But consider the stories he liked to tell on himself. He liked to tell the story of a person who met him on the street and simply said to him, "Sir, you're the ugliest man I've ever seen in my life." And Lincoln said to him, "Well, you know, I really can't help it." And the person said, "I know, but you can stay at home." The other one that was a favorite, Lincoln is riding in the woods one day and he comes across an extremely homely woman who raises her rifle and takes aim at him and says, "Prepare to die." And Lincoln says, "Madam, I don't know you. You must mistake me for someone else. Why are you doing this?" And she said, "I always swore that if I met a man uglier than I would shoot him on the spot." And he said, "Madam, if I'm uglier than you, fire away." Now, to artists who flocked to Lincoln to portray him, he joked around as well. That's the animal himself, he said, as the result of one sitting. It's very much like the critter, he said to a sculptor who did his bust. And to another group, because there was a time in Springfield, Illinois, when there would be 3 or 4 artists in a semicircle arrayed in front of him, painting his portrait at the same time. It was like a life class in an art school. And he would say things like, "I can't see why all you artists want a picture of me unless it's because I'm the homeliest man in the entire state of Illinois." But he knew why they wanted his picture. And there was in even that self-deprecating comment the implicit acknowledgement, all you artists want a picture of me. And they did. Why? Well, for one thing, he was a new figure on the national scene, an unexpected nominee for president. by the Republican Party in 1860. Intense curiosity followed. He was unknown. And of course, there was profit in introducing him. The profit motive for a bottom-up picture industry. These phenomena are rare today, like the Barack Obama portrait that's become such a major iconographical event of the 21st century. Rare indeed today is the campaign image that occurs spontaneously. Maybe we're entering a new world because of the blogosphere that will permit that to happen again. In the 20th century, campaign images were created by campaigns. They created the buttons, they created the bumper stickers that many of us wore or put on our cars in years gone by. But in the 19th century, in Lincoln's day, it was from the bottom up. They were pictures that were produced, buttons, all of these things produced by the industries that produced them in anticipation of orders from Republican clubs around the country, or simply anticipation of public demand that could be met through sales in catalogs and other means. Lincoln did sit for many photographs. He got the idea of how useful they could become, but he also yearned and understood that the fine arts offered him a way of being remembered. Photography offered a way for him to be known. The fine arts, a way to be remembered. And I think he understood the distinction between pictures, the carte de visite photographs for which he sat and which are on display in this museum, that were used in private homes. They were for private use, for family albums. And the other pictures that he later sat for, which were for public space, and ultimately to illustrate public memory, maybe to influence public memory. Was there a little vanity involved in this, more than he ever revealed publicly? I think so. And I think the pictures we'll look at today will help illustrate that little vain streak in Abraham Lincoln as well. Okay, now comes my technological test. Okay. Lincoln was photographed early in the age of photography, not always well. This is a picture taken by Nicholas Shepard in Springfield, Illinois in 1846, around the time of his election to Congress. And as you can see from his resplendent vest and that tie that wrapped around his neck at least 3 times, it seems to me, and the slick down hair. I don't know what he used, but he got it to stay down. And going to a photographer was not a casual thing. It was a Sunday effort. You put on your best clothes and you posed in your finery to be immortalized. But this was a one-image only picture. This was meant, as one of a pair with a picture of his wife, to decorate the family parlor for private use by the family itself. Things begin to change a little bit in the 1850s, and this is a picture that captures Lincoln a little more spontaneously. As he put it, his hair had a way of getting up in the world. This was a picture made in Chicago in 1854. He has obviously not ascended much in the tie department. It's quite a tie he has there. But he's beginning to understand that these images have a message to convey. And if you don't know what the message is, because this is Lincoln in 1854, the year he re-enters politics, inspired by the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which he hates so much. If you don't understand that, well, he's carrying a picture of, it's a little washed out, he's carrying a copy of the Chicago Tribune here, the anti-slavery newspaper. He's holding it out as if to say, here I am, here is what we are, this is the anti-slavery faction in Illinois. He still disliked most of the results of photography, understandably. This one looks fairly nice to us. It's certainly a well-known image. It was taken in Chicago also 3 years later by Alexander Hessler. One of the myths or stories attending this picture is that Lincoln posed for it, came with his hair slicked down, a la 1846, and Hessler ran his fingers through his hair because he liked this rumpled look. I don't know if I believe that, but Lincoln admitted that his wife didn't like this image, owing, he said, to the disordered condition of the hair. And this final pre-1860s image, showing you that things are not progressing well in the image department, is made in the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They seem almost focused on imperfections that a brush and comb really couldn't improve. You see the bags under his eyes, the rather pockmarked skin. Still pictures are primarily souvenirs. Lincoln is importuned into photo galleries. He doesn't volunteer that he needs his image made because that would, be immodest in the Victorian era. And that's about to change in some degree, not the modesty, but the utility of images. And this was the image that changed it. Made in my native city, he said boastfully, in New York, on the same day as he gave his Cooper Union address, February 27th, 1860. On a stroll up Broadway, Lincoln's young host invited him into Matthew Brady's photo gallery and took this exposure. You could see something different is afoot here. It's not one of these relentless close-ups that focus on his imperfections. Also, look at his collar here. And now look at it here. The truth is, right before the picture was made, Matthew Brady said, "Mr. Lincoln, pull up your collar." And Lincoln said, "I see you want to shorten my neck." And Brady said, "That's it exactly." So Lincoln pulled it up, and Brady took the picture. And this is known as the picture that made Lincoln president because Lincoln said so. But photography is still not yet at the stage where carte de visite photographs are mass-produced and sold. What this image does, like most Brady images up to the point, is it inspires other art forms. It inspires campaign lithographs that tell the story of Lincoln. And in an age when politicians, especially on the national stage, rarely ventured from their hometown to campaign on their own, such images begin to conquer distance. They begin to conquer time. And they spread the word about Abraham Lincoln without his even having to leave home. Here it's adapted into a small form, almost a miniature form, an ambrotype to wear in the campaign. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves where miniatures are concerned. At the beginning of the campaign, the image of choice is that 1857 image with the disordered hair that he and Mary didn't like because it seemed to reflect his homespun roots, even straightened out. This very image, by the way, this copy, and it's a very rare print, was thrown over the balcony of the wigwam, the hall where Lincoln was nominated, at the moment he went over the top in the balloting. They hurled it out there like we see confetti let loose out of netting and balloons let loose out of netting today when a candidate wins the nomination. Why have only a few survived? Well, first of all, it's pretty horrible. Second of all, and you see it has an attestation there, an affidavit about where it was discovered. I think that it was simply crushed underfoot. Once it was thrown down, it outlived its usefulness almost immediately. But the image as a source lived on. It became this source of even these rather fancy prints of Lincoln surrounded by the symbols of the country and a goddess of liberty on the right. They made him seem a representative man. Here the image is actually reversed and used to illustrate his rags to riches story. This is the rail splitter, the flatboatman, whose rise was a much more convenient story to tell wavering voters than a specific focus on such divisive issues as the party's opposition to the spread of slavery. So this is where the Lincoln image rested in the beginning of the 1860 campaign. But something else was clearly needed, because the Democrats soon began circulating a song, and they sang it. I'm not going to sing it, but I'm going to recite it. "Tell us of his fight with Douglas, how his spirit never quails. Tell us of his manly bearing, of his skill in splitting rails. Any lie you tell we'll swallow any kind of mixture. But oh, don't, we beg and pray you, don't, for God's sake, show his picture." The New York Times, which supported Lincoln, ran an editorial that says, "There seems to be a vigorous rivalry among portraitists to make Lincoln appear the ugliest of living men, a coarse and wrinkled personage who does not look as if a gleam of good nature ever disturbed him." Privately, a Wisconsin print salesman who was actually selling, it's so rare to find something like this, selling Lincoln images door to door, wrote back home to confide that the ladies to whom he was attempting to sell prints universally said to him, "What an ugly face. I can't decorate my home with that. And I hope in all conscience that Lincoln does not look like that." Well, Lincoln had tried to provide ameliorating visual rebuttal. and it had not been easy or painless, and I mean that literally. This is a life mask for which he sat in Chicago in March of 1860. He remembered the process as anything but agreeable because it hardened so fast, and I mean that in both senses of the word, quickly and hard, that when he tried to pull it, the artist tried to pull it off, he couldn't. I mean, he was sitting there with straws up his nose, at least he could breathe, and he tugged at it and pulled it off along with most of the hairs from his temples. And the poor guy cried. You know, it's involuntary. So he was not too happy. But when the sculptor, who was a cousin of his arch rival Stephen Douglas, he must have thought this was a politically motivated torture session, invited him back to pose for the bust that he hoped to create from that as a campaign piece. Lincoln went right back. He didn't think this would be painful, but when he got there, Volk said to him, "Sir, would you take off your shirt and lower your undershirt, your union suit?" Lincoln, who was not used to disrobing in public or in artist studios, of course did it. Volk said, "I want a representation of your brawny arms and shoulders." Who could resist, right? The problem is that he was so embarrassed that when the first sitting was over, he quickly put on his shirt and raced out into the street, down the steps. This is on Lake Street in Chicago. And people began laughing as he walked by, and he finally said, he was probably used to being laughed at in the street, but he finally said, "Well, sir, you're dragging the sleeves of your undershirt in the street." Lincoln had dressed so quickly he forgot to put on the undershirt first. So he had to go back up, and Volk had to help him dress. So it wasn't easy to get him in gear for the campaign. In 1860, in November, Lincoln takes up occupancy across the plaza from his law office, and this is a photograph taken across the plaza at this building, the Illinois State Capitol. Many of you will recognize it as the building before which Barack Obama announced his own candidacy for president on February 11th, 2007. The sitting governor had a suite of rooms there, and being an invalid, never used them. He stayed in the governor's mansion down the street. He gave Lincoln the suite, and Lincoln occupied it. This is the office, and this is where artists came to call. And this is where Lincoln welcomed them. To the first, Thomas Hicks of New York, he said, "I've never had this particular sort of picture made." But he posed. The first artists all came saying that they were on a mission from publishers of lithographs and engravings. "You've seen all those horrible prints out there, Mr. Lincoln. We want to do something better." Well, he wasn't a very compliant sitter. He was terribly busy, and he would not sit still the way George Washington famously did for Gilbert Stuart in later years. He needed to be on the jump, as he put it, open his mail, greet people. So Hicks established a pattern. He asked Lincoln to pose for a photograph, which Lincoln actually did in the State House, down the hall, in front of the big windows, and this was the result. And it's a gorgeous plate, and as you can see, it inspired this print. And Hicks took the canvas back to New York, where it was engraved and put out by W.H. Schaus and Company, and became a campaign print for New York. Boston sent its own artist, Thomas M. Johnston, who created this image, which became the basis of a very rare print. I guess it wasn't well received. Used actually also as a campaign poster for a Lincoln-Hamlin campaign poster. Ultimately, he also did a painting based on a photograph. Later that month, an artist from St. Louis, Alban Jasper Conant, produces this image, a smiling Lincoln, but it was not reproduced for the campaign. Mary Lincoln liked it. She said it looked the way she thought her husband appeared when he had his friends about him, and then she added, "I hope he will look like that after November." And then comes one of my favorite of these itinerants, Charles Alfred Barry, who decides that Lincoln should be sort of a Byronic Greek god figure. And this is the wash drawing that he produces. And Lincoln supposedly says to him, "Even my enemies must declare that to be a true likeness of Old Abe." Never in a million years would Lincoln refer to himself as Old Abe, or probably refer to this as a true likeness. But it was brought back to Boston again, and made into a campaign print whose rarity, again, indicates that Boston was still struggling to get its own image together. By the way, as all this is happening, you keep in mind that the copyright laws are so lax that printmakers' sincerest form of flattery is imitation or piracy. This image, as odd as it is stolen by someone else who makes it even odder. And more painters follow. J.C. Wolfe does a painting of Lincoln and perhaps doesn't think it's much of a success because rather than pay rent to his temporary landlord, he skips out of town and leaves it behind. The local minister, Louis Peter Clover, does a painting. The locals liked him. The local newspaper said, "It will bear the closest inspection." Very nondescript, glowing review, don't you think? This image was obviously not calculated to win votes or influence people. But there's the first June and July, the first couple of months of Lincoln's posing for the fine arts. Paintings for New York, paintings for Massachusetts, and paintings for home. Most were substantial in size, actually specifically formatted to be copied on stone and steel for lithographs or engravings. But that left the crucial state of Pennsylvania without an image of its own. It's sort of testimony to this strictness of borders between states, to the primacy of state originality, that each state did feel it needed an image, that New Yorkers weren't going to buy the Boston image and Boston people weren't going to buy the New York image. And Pennsylvania was certainly, of those three states, the most crucial of all. A real bellwether in the election. The Democratic Party had split, giving Lincoln an advantage. Fusion efforts were working in President Buchanan's home state in support of not Stephen A. Douglas, but Vice President John Breckinridge, even though he was the Southern Union candidate, the Southern Democratic candidate. Meanwhile, Pennsylvania Republicans were also sort of divided in an unruly way. At least their loyalties were divided between factions loyal to or opposed to their own favorite son, United States Senator Simon Cameron, who had many, many loyal friends in Pennsylvania and many, many bitter enemies. Most of his loyal friends were probably the beneficiaries of his relentless corruption over a long period of time, and many of those who opposed him probably hadn't had their hand in the pie. But that's why the state was so complicated and up for grabs. To answer the challenge, in the state that would later inspire Lincoln's shortest and most influential speech, the Gettysburg Address, the state also inspired his smallest and most influential campaign portrait. 5.5 inches from top to bottom and just 4.5 inches across. And like the address that would come up 3 years later, a jewel of precise expression and radiating beauty. This is not it, but this is the man who inspired it. Judge John Meredith Reed. Always look to the patrons, because there is a story in with the patrons who commission works of art. He's the 63-year-old Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Grandson of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, born across the street from Independence Hall, anti-slavery man, early organizer of the Republican Party, bitter enemy of home state favorite son Simon Cameron. In fact, he had actually been spoken of as a contender for president at the Republican convention that Lincoln won. He got 1 vote at the Republican convention. That's more than most people got. Then he became a candidate for vice president, but he was not given that nod either. That went to a man from Maine, Hannibal Hamlin. But Judge Reed became a regular correspondent with Lincoln. It was clear he wanted influence for himself. He wanted Lincoln to win Pennsylvania, but he wanted to get the credit for Lincoln winning Pennsylvania. If Lincoln won and Simon Cameron got the credit, well, it wouldn't be very useful for the anti-Cameron forces in the Republican Party. So he wrote letters that started with things like, "We are going at this election day and night." This is the most crucial state in the country, and we have the most to fear here. Lincoln needed those electoral votes to cobble together a majority. So Reed hired perhaps the most famous painter of miniatures in the country, John Henry Brown. This is his portrait of a young boy, recently purchased by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, end of plug for the Met. And here is an early self-portrait of John Henry Brown. He was born in Lancaster in 1818. He had studied in something called Arthur Armstrong's painting room beginning at age 18, and like many painters, began as a sign painter. At age 26, he became a specialist in miniatures, for which there were always patrons. And then he went on to Philadelphia and became a favorite of very much local royalty. He painted James Buchanan and his niece, Harriet Lane, Lincoln's and Mary Lincoln's predecessors. He painted the Biddles and the Drexels. He painted a touring actor named John Wilkes Booth. He had many patrons. Here's another miniature of Brown. We don't have anything that gives us a sense of what he looked like when he painted Lincoln. He was 42 years old in 1860. This one, he's a young man. And here he's an older man. And this is a miniature by Charles Van Dyke Brown, his son, probably made in the 1880s when he confided to his diary that he'd finally stopped wearing a toupee. In 1860, he was 42 years old, somewhere in between these two stages of his life. And so was his art, somewhere between these two stages of life. Because as Brown's contemporary in this specialty, Henry Whale, explained, the specialty was becoming passé. My business as a miniature painter, he said, which in former days throve, I guess that's the past tense of thrive, very poetic, has from month to month been dying on account of the increasing popularity of photographing, which you will no doubt know now monopolizes the legitimate business of artists. So there's a sense that photography is illegitimate, but that photography is becoming increasingly competitive. Well, enter Judge James Meredith Reed. He asked Brown to go to Illinois. Why a miniaturist? No one really knows. Did he simply like John Henry Brown? Had he used him before? We're still trying to find the answer. Did he think it would be easy to do a painting in miniature and then transport it without difficulty in the artist's possession? Today, museums hire couriers who buy seats on airplanes for works of art that are small and transportable. Maybe the same thing, he had the same thing in mind for the railroad journey. No one knows. But he certainly charmed Lincoln's private secretary, John G. Nicolay, who writes to his fiancée, Judge Reed of Philadelphia has become, and this is a good explanation of what he had in mind for the miniaturist, has become so disgusted with the horrible caricatures of Mr. Lincoln, which he had seen, that he went to the expense of sending this artist all the way out here to paint this picture. It'll probably cost him some $300, the price of the painting alone being $175. I had a long talk with the artist today. He says the impression prevails back east that Mr. Lincoln is very ugly, an impression which the published pictures of him, of course, confirm. Reed, however, had an idea that it could hardly be so, but was bound to have a good-looking picture, and therefore instructed the artist to make it good-looking, whether the original would justify it or not. Again, it would not be easy. Lincoln would not, he said to the artist, don't fasten me into a chair. It's not easy for an artist to paint if the guy is not fastened into a chair. Lincoln is also constantly bombarded with visitors. In times that he saw artists, we know that office seekers besieged him, old friends, politicians, journalists, critics, a frontier woman who arrived one day to say, I can't believe you ever amounted to anything, having known you. A professional lecturer declaiming Shakespearean soliloquies in advance of a Springfield performance. Once Lincoln was sitting for an artist and a suspicious-looking package arrived, sitting for a sculptor, and Lincoln thought it looked like a bomb. he had received enough death threats to be worried. So the artist suggested that he open it against the clay model of his face, so that in case it exploded, the bust would absorb the blow. It's a little bit strange. Judge Reed summoned and commissioned Brown, who I show here, on August 4th, 1860. He took his son, Charles, which I never knew until I began my research for this paper, with him on the trip, an experience that probably turned him into a miniature artist of himself in later years. And he headed for Springfield on August 9th. It was a long journey which he recorded meticulously in his diary through Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois. 2.5 days, 952 miles. He arrived on Sunday, August 12th, just 4 days after a massive Republican rally had swarmed through Springfield, with thousands marching past Lincoln's home, and then ushering him to the fairgrounds, where he only uttered a few perfunctory words. The next day, the 12th being the Sabbath, Brown writes to his patron, "I called at Mr. Lincoln's house," nothing dramatic. "I found that he had already left home, and Mrs. Lincoln was too unwell to see me. So I went to the executive chamber in the state capitol, where I did have the pleasure of seeing Mr. Lincoln." Brown handed Lincoln an engraving of Judge Reed, so Lincoln could become familiar with the mastermind of this project. Reed wanted Lincoln to know this was his idea, and he wanted credit for this enterprise. And he handed him a letter from Judge Reed, and as the artist recalled, at once he consented to sit for the picture. Brown wrote in his diary, after looking at Lincoln for the first time, "There are so many hard lines in his face that it becomes a mask to the inner man. His true character only shines out when in an animated conversation or when telling an amusing tale, of which he's very fond. He's said to be a homely man. I do not think so." But he was not going to be easy to capture or made to be hold still. So Brown says, "I took him to have a daguerre," as he put it, taken immediately. "We walked together to a daguerrean room." It was in fact an ambrotype, not a daguerreotype, but as Brown writes, "I had half a dozen ambrotypes taken of him before I could get one to suit me. I was favorably impressed with Mr. Lincoln. In the afternoon, I unpacked my painting materials, but not before he had before him this ambrotype of Abraham Lincoln." Often viewed as a great campaign image that shows Lincoln in the last stages of the campaign, but what it is a commissioned model for an artist. Here's the diary. And it's, again, meticulous and illuminating. April 14th, commenced Mr. Lincoln's picture, at it all day. April 15th, at Mr. Lincoln's picture. So far, he hasn't posed Lincoln. He's working from the ambrotype. April 16th, Mr. Lincoln gave me his first sitting in the library. I called to see Mrs. Lincoln, much pleased with her. April 17th, April 18th, at Mr. Lincoln's picture. Received an invitation from Mrs. Lincoln to take tea with them. April 20th is the Sabbath, and then Mr. Lincoln's second sitting, this time in a new place, Representative Hall, in the old state capitol. Why? I think it's because Brown needed a little more light than he could get in the governor's suite. Just 2 years before Lincoln had given his House divided speech in this chamber. 5 years later, he would lay in state here. But Brown did more work here, a third sitting on the 22nd, and then after a day of retouching, a fourth sitting on the 24th, a fifth and final one on the 25th. And then he notes exuberantly in his diary, "The picture gives great satisfaction. Mrs. Lincoln speaks of it in the most extravagant terms of approbation." And finally, after all 35 pictures I've shown you so far, I'm ready to unveil a picture I hope you know, but here is the image. Exquisite, jewel-like, and eventually enormously influential. After seeing the candidate in church that final Sunday, Brown wrote home to his patron to say what he tried to express in the miniature, I think. "Mr. Lincoln must be seen and known to be properly appreciated. 10 minutes after I was in his presence, I felt as if I'd known him for years. He has an easy frankness and charm of manner which made me comfortable and happy while in his presence." So the miniature went on view in the State House, in that Hall of Representatives, under a magnifying glass, Because think of it, it's only this big, not that big. People came and viewed it under a magnifying glass, and Brown is very proud. He writes, "I hardly know how to express the strength of my personal regard for Mr. Lincoln. I never saw a man for whom I so formed so profound an attachment. I like him much. I agree with him in all things but his politics." There's an interesting thing. Brown was evidently a Democrat. He is kind, he's very sociable, he's immensely popular among the people of Springfield. That's sort of a perfunctory reading because Lincoln actually won half of the Springfield votes on election day. It was always right down the middle in Springfield, even 4 years later. Even those opposed to him in politics speak of him in unqualified terms of praise. He's 51 years old, 6 feet 4 inches, he weighs 160 pounds, that's actually 20 pounds too little. He is apparently in excellent health. He looks about 40 or 45 years of age. And this is his last diary entry from Springfield. August 27th. The people of Springfield who have seen Mr. Lincoln's picture speak of it in strong terms of approbation. That seems to be the little excerpt of reviews that he likes to do, declaring it to be the best that has yet been taken of him. John Nicolay, the secretary, loved it. So he writes back to his fiancée. And he says, "Did you ever see a real pretty miniature? I don't mean an ambrotype, a daguerreotype, or a photograph, but a regular miniature painted on ivory." Well, a Philadelphia artist, Brown his name is, has just been painting one of Mr. Lincoln, which is both very pretty and very truthful. Decidedly the best picture of him I've ever seen. About twice as large as a common quarter-sized daguerreotype, but so well executed that when magnified to life size, one cannot discover any defects or brush marks on it at all. I wish you could see it. It gives one something of an idea of what a painter, I mean a real artist, can do. And continues Nicolay, one of the longest descriptions of a painting we have in the literature, so it's very useful. The artist says he came out with a good deal of foreboding that he would have difficulty in taking a picture under these conditions. He says he was very happy when on seeing him he found he was not at all such a man as had been represented. Instead of making a picture, he would only have to make a portrait. I think he's got it flipped. I think he means instead of having to make a portrait, he has to make a picture, but who knows, to satisfy Judge Reed. He will go back home, listen carefully to this, as agreeably disappointed in Mr. Lincoln's manners and refinement as in his personal appearance. So flip that around. It's sort of a ironic, sarcastic way of saying Lincoln is just as well-mannered as his pretty miniature would suggest. The artist was instructed not just to make a pretty and truthful miniature, whether the original deserved it or not, to get endorsements. Judge Reed is thinking ahead of how to promote this picture for the campaign. You promote it by getting people who know Lincoln to say, "It's terrific." So he gets Mary Lincoln to write a letter. He's obviously had tea with her, he's ingratiated himself. "Mr. Brown of your city has taken a miniature likeness of my husband, which is perfect. I see no fault or defect, whatever." And then he hits the bonanza. To Judge Reed, "My dear sir, the miniature likeness of myself taken by your friend J. Henry Brown is an excellent one, so far as I can judge." I think that's a little joke, right? Because Judge Reed is a judge. "To my unpracticed eye, it is without fault. Yours truly, A. Lincoln." Lincoln would praise his portrait, but he would always caution that he had an unpracticed eye, that he was an indifferent judge, that he was an uneducated viewer. He didn't like to, get right in there and boast about the results. The local newspapers added their comments. The pro-Lincoln Illinois Daily State Journal wrote, "It's a splendid miniature." Of course, the pro-Lincoln Illinois Daily State Journal never saw anything they didn't like about Abraham Lincoln. In those days, the press was either Republican or Democratic. And this newspaper was so close to Abraham Lincoln, reflected his every view so carefully that Democrats used to joke about it and call it Lincoln's organ. That was the newspaper. You have to know that newspapers were called organs, and that's why there's a joke there. Maybe it just sounded obscene unless I explained the newspaper thing first. Viewed under magnification, said the paper, which seems to be the way it was displayed, instead of presenting a more rugged appearance as it grows larger, the naturalness of its expression is increased. So here was ideal image making made for voter persuasion. And remember, that's what it was made for. It's in a museum, but it wasn't made for a museum. It was made to make Lincoln look handsome, whether the original justified it or not, and to be reproduced. And that's what eventually happened. But why on earth did it take 4.5 weeks to do? Well, that's the mystery. And I think the explanation, we finally realized, lies in the diaries. First, Reed took his time getting home. He had his boy with him. So instead of repeating the 950-mile journey, he took him to see Niagara Falls. He took a tour. He went to Canada. Even Lincoln had only gone to Niagara Falls once in his entire life. The total mileage, which he records, 1,152. He doesn't get home until August 31st, and then not until September 3rd does Judge Reed acknowledge that he gave him the miniature that he had paid for with the letters. He writes to Lincoln, "Of yourself, Mrs. Lincoln, and Mr. Nicolay. It is a magnificent work of art and must be a faithful likeness. It corresponds with your bust, of which I have a copy." So he has a copy of that statue that Lincoln posed for so uncomfortably. So now Judge Reed takes the miniature and gives it to the next artist to deal with it. Samuel Sartain, the eldest son of John Sartain, perhaps the most famous engraver in America. The engraving is commenced, Judge Reed announced, and is promised to be finished in 2 weeks. Now, it makes a difference. The elections are coming up. Not just the national election in November, but the state elections for governor. That's going to occur on October 15th. In America of that period, people were election happy. They loved to have elections. Even during the Civil War, it was not just every 2 years, elections all the time. So there was a state election on October 15th, and then November 5th was the national election. They wanted this picture out to influence the election. And it's a matter of, it's proof of its importance to see how breathlessly the mass-produced adaptation was anticipated. Maybe breathlessly is not the right word. Maybe impatiently is the right word. It was considered a political weapon. Its delay became worrisome to Lincoln's supporters, and after a while, it was Nicolay, the secretary, sort of the de facto campaign manager, who reached out to Brown from Springfield to find out what on earth was happening. Election day was only 5 weeks away, the state election was only 2 weeks away, and the artist wrote to him to say, "You're wondering why you haven't seen or heard anything of the engraving. Mr. Sartain promised to have it completed within 2 weeks when it was placed in his hands 3 weeks ago, but 2 days ago the first proof was placed in my hand for criticism. I suggested alterations, which are being made. I will now examine it again with care, and if necessary will have further corrections made as my judgment may suggest." Everyone is reminding themselves that they're now the judge, not Judge Reed. And he clearly has the sign-off on the final image. "In accordance with my promise, you will not allow any copies to be issued until they meet my approbation." There's his favorite word again. But he admitted, as a sort of a good note, Mr. Lincoln's friends are in high spirits and full of hope. Judge Reed is completely nervous about Sartain's delay. He thinks the engraving good. He wanted some copies yesterday. And here he goes again. "But as I am judge in this case, I would not consent. I think tomorrow or Monday next it'll be ready and copies will be sent." Lincoln was worried about the election. Just a few weeks before, he had told his vice presidential running mate that he was worried that Republicans were on what he called the downhill track, that negativism might lose us the state elections in Pennsylvania and then ruin us on the main turn in November. He was nervous too, and his people wanted the print as a response. Well, around October 1st, it finally arrived. Based on the miniature, never done in color, done as a black and white steel engraving. It boasts one of the most precise captions in Lincoln iconography, indicating all the parties were proud of this enterprise. Based on the miniature from life by J. Henry Brown in the possession of Judge Reed. He wanted his name on these as well. By October 5th, Lincoln has 2 framed copies in his hands. And he's smarter than Judge Reed at politics. He's not going to thank him and say, I hope that this helps in the election. He's going to wait until after the state election, when he doesn't have to thank him for the prince having had any influence. So October 19th, he acknowledges their arrival and says, "We're indulging in much rejoicing over the late splendid victories in Pennsylvania, which seem to foreshadow the certain success of the Republican cause in November." Well, it was Nicolay who confided that Lincoln was in fact delighted with the beauty of the engravings and, as he put it, their fidelity to the original. Nicolay gets the State Journal newspaper to endorse it, and he writes, "I'm highly gratified that Mr. Lincoln's friends in Pennsylvania will at length be enabled to obtain a good likeness of him." When the election is over on October 15th in the state of Pennsylvania, A.K. McClure, a local editor, wrote to Lincoln, "The national contest is altogether over in Pennsylvania, utterly abandoned by the Democrats." Did the image move people to Lincoln? Did it make any difference? Of course, it's hard to calculate. Lincoln won with over 55% of the vote on November 5th in Pennsylvania. He won the electoral votes. His worries were for naught. But the new image certainly hadn't helped. Judge Reed certainly wanted Lincoln to think that it hadn't hurt. He wrote Lincoln immediately during the election polling, while the votes are being counted, he telegraphed about what he called this triumphant election. He was staking his claim to credit. But even Lincoln's friend Norman Judd, an Illinois friend, put it this way: "Every little bit helps. And I'm coming to believe that likenesses, broadcast, are excellent means of electioneering." 2 days after the election, the New York World also spoke about the power of campaign images. "One cannot lay his hand upon Lincoln's bosom and say that old Abe is a handsome man," it wrote. Yet he'd been so often crayon, painted, pencil sketched, and photographed that he had become tolerably familiar to that many-headed monster, the general public. Not only familiar, but romanticized. If you read the descriptions after the election, he's now seen to have by correspondence, to have lustrous eyes like Daniel Webster. He was thin, but not so much that it disguised his commanding presence, writes another. He may have had deep lines around his mouth, wrote a third correspondent, but they were a certificate of that strenuous toil through which he has made his way up to fame. Lincoln's strenuous toil at this stage would now include perhaps focus on assembling a cabinet, balancing the advice of many advisors. And why is that part of the story? Because as the fight looms about how to reward Pennsylvania for its victory, both giving him their votes in the convention and supplying him with 55% of the vote on election day, the fight turns to Simon Cameron. Cameron wants to be Secretary of the Treasury. Of course, because as Willie Sutton said, "Why do I rob banks? Because that's where he is." Of course he wants to be Secretary of the Treasury. Guess who emerges as an alternative to Cameron in rewarding Pennsylvania? There are several people. Judge John Meredith Reed. So one of the things he does is quickly get out a picture of Lincoln with his new beard based on the other one. Just had a Sartain slap a beard on. People are warning Lincoln. There are Pennsylvanians who are working to accomplish their own selfish purposes regardless of the true interests either of the party or the country. The pretensions of Mr. Reed here are regarded as preposterous and absurd. But Reed did have supporters, because another Pennsylvanian wrote on January 7th, when this picture was being widely circulated, that Cameron's appointment would cause more well-grounded dissatisfaction than that of Reed. The judge was obviously pretty sure of himself, because he packed up and went to Washington and ostensibly lay a different case before Lincoln, that of raiding regiments in case of war. But no doubt the idea was to put himself on display in front of Lincoln. And he didn't get the job, but he would continue to jockey for influence with Lincoln for years, writing about military conscription, about promoting deserving Pennsylvania officers, and then a very ill-advised series of letters saying, "Suspend the military draft in Pennsylvania or you will have degrading riots like you did in New York." I don't think Lincoln liked that series of correspondence. He did not want to be told that the draft had to be suspended in major northern cities, and Reed's influence began to erode, even as Brown's picture had this new life. Well, Reed was not about to give up, and in not giving up, he made another mistake. He said, "I would like to come to the White House to see you." And once again, he got to have tea with the Lincolns. But this time, Mary Lincoln said to him, "Judge, the portrait you ordered painted of Mr. Lincoln is the best ever made of my husband. I often wish it were mine." Well, the judge answered, "It is entirely at your service, madam." Mary said, "When will you send it to me?" And he replied, "As soon as I reach home." Reed had been displaying it alongside a miniature of Andrew Jackson. But he sent it on, and it remained with Mary for her whole life and then stayed in the Lincoln family. Another irony is that another artist, Francis B. Carpenter, about whom I'll speak for a second in a few minutes, had painted Mary wearing a miniature likeness. I hope you can detect it on her bosom there. But of course, it's not the John Henry Brown likeness. It's based on this picture she hated. It's that image, which I guess she had finally come to terms with. The Preston Butler photographs also faded from view. If there were really 6 poses, only 2 survived. This is the other one. You see, the hair is sort of floppy. I always wonder which photograph comes first, the close-up or the distant shot. Does the camera move in or move out? I don't know. The hair is a little floppier here. He's moved it a little bit. So it either fell during the camera movement toward him, or he brushed it back, or whatever. Here's another shot I find interesting, because in 1863, 3 years later, he's affecting the same folded arms pose. This is by a Treasury Department photographer named Lewis Walker, unconsciously maybe mimicking the pose that had helped create that campaign image. But look at the change in just 3 years. No one would mistake Lincoln for 40 or 45 years old anymore. No one could disguise the anguish with which he was dealing with his presidency, or suggested that he looked younger than his years. As for John Henry Brown, he painted at least 2 copies of his miniature. I don't know the location of the originals, but we have this copy and the back of it marked. Many artists followed Reed to view Abraham Lincoln over the next 5 years. Lincoln always seemed to make time for artists and sculptors, especially after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It's as if he knew that his face and his act had to be almost canonized for future memory. The taste for miniatures declined. The fatal blow was dealt by the invention of the carte de visite photograph. So easily and inexpensively made, so easily reproduced. Lincoln inspired ever larger portraits that mirrored his own growing stature as an American hero. And Carpenter, who painted the cabinet as it heard the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, and also painted that miniature of Mary Lincoln, painted perhaps the largest of all. This canvas is 14 feet by 9 feet. He took over the state dining room of the White House to set up his canvas. When it was transported for exhibition throughout the country after 1864, it was done on a collapsible frame. The problem was that every time it folded up, it probably lost some paint, and I think the seam must have been right on Lincoln, because Carpenter repainted and overpainted so much that he sort of lost the original look. But if that was the largest, and this was probably the smallest, and one of the most influential. If this portrait defines the public Lincoln, the state Lincoln, this defines what Lincoln wanted to see himself as during his campaign. It helped win a state and a national election. It helped damp down reports that Lincoln was too ugly to be president. It helped introduce a president-elect. Was it really real pretty and real truthful? Well, it was pretty. And it did a pretty powerful job of making a difference in a crucial state. It involved politicians and engravers and promoters and an artist's son, a future artist. It helped create a transfiguration. When Abraham Lincoln grew a beard, so did this portrait, in a sense. Iconographically, it inspired a memorable photograph and two versions of a popular print. One, this quintessential campaign image, and the other, one of the first to show Lincoln as a bewhiskered and avuncular statesman, up to the crisis of the war. Here he is, not as ugly as had been supposed, dignified enough to be president. In the bearded version, more serious. Not a 50-year-old who looks 40, but a man who looks prepared for the sectional crisis about to afflict the country. But ultimately became a relic, hidden in the recesses of the Lincoln family, and a testament as well to a bygone and lost artistic tradition and fashion. And thus, it's altogether unique. For miniature painting, fell totally out of fashion around the time this painting was completed. The daguerreotypes and ambrotypes, which once served as Brown's models, were totally supplanted by the easily made, widely reproducible in-studio carte de visite, ubiquitous and cheap, not only of your friends and family, but of your leaders, those you wanted to honor by owning a picture. What Brown offered, color and delicacy, prettiness, was in an age of realism accentuated through the prism of mass suffering and death and destruction brought on by the Civil War. That kind of delicacy and prettiness was no longer an attraction. Americans saw Lincoln age through photographs, as in this photograph by a firm called Wenderoth and Taylor of Philadelphia, made for another campaign, that of 1864. I show it because by the time it was made, the firm that issued it had also renamed itself. I was surprised. I know you shouldn't underline your own research, but I was surprised to find this. By the time it was made, the firm had been renamed. It was now Wenderoth, Taylor, and Brown. Its new partner, third build, was none other than the once famous miniaturist John Henry Brown. Now his job was not to create original works of art, but one only knows, to pose sitters, perhaps tint photographs. It was a long fall, but he no longer had a career as a miniaturist. But he enjoyed a revival, part of the colonial revival. In 1876, he was exhibited at the National Academy. He got a medal at the Philadelphia Centennial. He got his own exhibition, and what was once politically relevant and then died suddenly became quaint. And again, Brown had his patrons and his customers. And he practiced until the eve of his death in 1890. But the influence of his work had come and gone. Looking at it, what Brown said on first meeting Lincoln seems apt. I don't think any painter can do him full justice. He is of a lively disposition. He laughs and smiles a great deal. He shows to most advantage at such times, but of course, that cannot be painted to. No artist really ever captured the full elasticity of the living, breathing Lincoln. But Brown took the most unusual and perhaps incongruous approach of all of them. He took a giant subject and made a tiny but irresistible miniature that had to be viewed under a magnifying glass to reveal its full effect. He made a picture based on a photograph that inspired an engraving. And it did some crucial campaigning for a candidate who did not do any campaigning for president for himself. Viewers peered closely at a man who was so big he created shadows wherever he strode. And that was the irony of this beautiful portrait, the beautiful irony. In Lincoln, Brown had found the subject of a lifetime. In John Henry Brown, Lincoln had found a wholly sympathetic and gifted artist at the only possible moment when their interaction was to make a could have made a difference. Though his method of expression was, in a sense, a dying art, his subject was the rising man. They met at the crossroads of each other's reputations, one destined for glory, the other for obscurity, but both determined promoters with many backers, and this was the result. It more than deserves to be in this national collection, not only for its beauty, but because it so perfectly represents a time, a place, an artist, a mode of expression, and a subject, a quintessential American icon of a president on the eve of an election that transformed him and transformed the country. A redefining moment, and I think a rediscovered work of art that well deserves our scrutiny and indeed our affection. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.